in terms of how Americans are feeling right now about this presidential term and about how things are going in the country right now. Well, there's lots of new data on that I can show you right now. Let's start with the new CNN poll. New CNN poll shows that Donald Trump has never been more unpopular than he is right now. Donald Trump's disapproval rating in this new CNN poll, it's actually higher. His disapproval rating is higher than it was in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. After January 6th, a whopping 62% of Americans said they disapproved of Trump. Today, the number of Americans who say they disapprove of Donald Trump is not 62%, it is 63%. 63% disapprove, only 37% approve of Trump. That means right now he is 26 points underwater in terms of his approval rating with the American people. That's astonishing. Elsewhere in this CNN poll, we learned that Americans say that Trump has hurt America's standing in the world more than helped it. And they say that by a 24-point margin. Since he has been back in office, he has hurt America's standing in the world more than he has helped it. America, how do you feel about Trump tearing down the East Wing of the White House? Well, 10% of Americans say they like that. His support on that is 10%. More than 5 times as many Americans say him doing that makes them feel dissatisfied or angry. He's underwater by 44 points on tearing down the East Wing of the White House to build his ballroom. Washington Post, ABC News Ipsos poll is also just out. Trump's overall approval rating in that poll, he's underwater minus 18. In this poll, right after January 6th, his disapproval rating spiked to 60%. Again, that's right after January 6th. Disapproval, 60%. Today in this poll, it's 59% disapproval, which means in this poll, he is within 1 point of where he was in the immediate wake of his supporters laying violent siege to the U.S. Capitol in a failed attempt to try to seize power by force. And they asked a question here. Not just bluntly, do you approve or disapprove of Trump, but they asked it a little nuance to it in a way that is always interesting to me, because even if you are not a supporter of President Trump, let's say, everybody knows somebody who is a really strong supporter of Trump, right? I mean, whether it's a coworker or an uncle or some other family member, maybe there's, a neighbor down the street who's got all the Trump flags on his truck or whatever. I mean, everybody knows somebody, and the national media pays so much attention to people who are strong Trump supporters. But how many of them are there? Well, look at this. This, again, is that Washington Post, ABC News Ipsos poll. Trump's overall approval rating is minus 18. He's 18 points underwater overall. But if you look at the nuance, if you look at the people who feel strongly, the proportion of Americans who strongly approve of Trump is 20%. The proportion of Americans who strongly disapprove of Trump is 46%. People who strongly disapprove of Trump outnumber the people who strongly approve of him by significantly more than 2 to 1. And Americans disapprove of him on everything. America, do you approve of Donald Trump in his handling of Israel's war in Gaza? No, minus 6. Do you approve of Trump's handling of crime? No, minus 11. Do you approve of Trump's handling of immigration? No, minus 13. Do you approve of Trump's management of our relationship with other countries? No, minus 19. Do you approve of Trump's handling of the Russia-Ukraine war? No, minus 21. Do you approve of Trump's handling of the economy? No, minus 25. Do you approve of Trump's management of the federal government? No, minus 27. Do you approve of Trump's handling of tariffs, his signature issue, what he most wants to be known for in this presidential term? Do you approve of Donald Trump's handling of tariffs? No, Americans do not approve of him on tariffs. He is minus 32 on that issue. Since Trump has been back in office, has he made the United States weaker or stronger? Americans say Trump has made the United States weaker, and they say so by a 15-point margin. Should ICE agents be wearing masks out in the street? No, 16-point margin. Should Trump be sending the National Guard to states over the objections of those states' governors? No, 18-point margin. The criminal charges that Trump has demanded against James Comey and John Bolton, are those criminal charges justified, or are those politically motivated bogus prosecutions? Americans say those charges are politically motivated by a 13 and 14-point margin. America, do you like the fact that Trump is tearing down the White House East Wing to build his ballroom? No. In this poll, no. Americans say they do not like that by a 28-point margin. How about Trump's plan to take $230 million for himself from the U.S. Justice Department, supposedly as some kind of compensation for all he's been through? He wants the federal government to write him a check for $230 million. America, do you like that idea? Shockingly, no, by a 42-point margin. Americans say no, they hate that idea very much. Thank you. And it's not just the CNN poll and that Washington Post poll. There's the new NBC poll, which unfolds along much the same lines. The NBC poll has Trump's approval rating 12 points underwater. And again, they do that nuance. How strong are your feelings? Americans who strongly disapprove of Trump outnumber Americans who strongly approve of him by a whopping 18 points in the NBC poll. Here's my new favorite polling question, though. This is from the NBC poll. I'd like it if all national pollsters would please start asking this. Do you consider yourself to be a supporter of the No Kings protest movement? That's how they ask the question. What do you think the answer is to that? What proportion of the American public says they consider themselves to be a supporter of the No Kings movement in this country? What do you think the number's going to be? I mean, for context, in this same poll, in this NBC poll, they also asked people if they consider themselves to be a supporter of the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, the Trump movement. The proportion of Americans who said they consider themselves to be a MAGA supporter is 30%. I should note that's fallen by 6 points in the past 6 months in this same poll, but still, that's okay. Round number, understandable number. 30% of Americans say they consider themselves to be a supporter of the MAGA movement. Compared to that, what proportion of Americans say they are a supporter of the No Kings movement? 43%. 43% of this country says they consider themselves to be a supporter of the No Kings protest movement, which means not only does the base of support for the No Kings movement absolutely dwarf the base of support for MAGA in this country, but in absolute terms, it also means that support for No Kings, support for the No Kings movement against Trump, it's just huge. I mean, 43% of this country, that's 147 million people. I think we're going to need a bigger boat. I mean, that number is absolutely stunning to me. I got to say, I have covered the heck out of the No Kings movement as it has taken shape from the very outset of this presidential term for Trump. I would have thought organizers and participants in these protests would be whooping and hollering and cheering if they learned that they had 10% support in this country or 15% support in this country. 43%? Well, MAGA support is 30%, and it's been dropping hard since Trump has been back in office. I don't know what terrible numbers like these for Trump and terrible numbers like these for his MAGA movement are going to mean for tomorrow's elections. I will tell you, CNN asked about it in sort of a roundabout way in their poll. CNN asked, if you were voting for Congress today, would you think of your vote as being more to send a message of support to Trump, or would you think of your vote as being a message of opposition to Trump? They asked that question in the new CNN poll, and the proportion of Americans who said they wanted their vote to be seen as a message of support for Trump, that proportion is 21%. The proportion of Americans who said they wanted their vote to be a message of opposition to Trump was nearly twice that, 41%. So, I mean, read into that what you may. If you're a business leader watching this right now thinking about, I wonder if we should continue to do things to really kowtow to Trump and to be really seen to be putting our thumb on the scale in order to please Trump. I wonder if that'll be good for our bottom line. Take a little temperature of the public here, guys. you're aligning yourself with something pretty radically and deeply unpopular. And what is Trump himself doing to make himself more palatable to the American people as we head toward tomorrow's election day? Well, on the eve of tomorrow's vote, the administration cut off SNAP food benefits for 42 million of the poorest Americans, including many, 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 many millions of Republican voters. The SNAP program goes back to the Great Depression. It has never cut people off before, but the Trump administration cut people off as of Saturday. And then today, only when forced by a federal court in Rhode Island, did they begrudgingly concede that they might half fund SNAP benefits. And who knows for how long? Meanwhile, literally at the same time he is cutting off food aid to 40+ million Americans, Trump was bragging online about the new marble and gold-toned bathroom he just built himself at the White House. At your expense. He held a party at his mansion at Mar-a-Lago, which had a Roaring '20s Great Gatsby theme, because, yeah, remind me again what happened right at the end of the Roaring '20s? Google 1929, just see what comes up.